Welcome back to part two of our lecture on the Indo-European migrations. In part one, we talked about how the adventure book story of Heinrich Schliemann to recover what he felt certainly was the lost history of Homer's Iliad advanced our understanding, as it turns out, a great deal about the actual Bronze Age civilizations that occupied the Eastern Mediterranean. If not exactly the mythic heroes he'd hoped for and proclaimed, nevertheless, Schliemann did open up a new door onto history. To understand that history, we have to follow its trail of migration. To know the Homeric heroes of the Bronze Age, we have to follow them in their historical path, not so much in their mythological path, but rather in their historical path as a story of migration. May have arrived even 1,000 years before the time of the events described by Homer. So now we add yet another time frame here. I told you to buckle in. It was going to be a wild ride from the late Bronze Age setting of the Homeric stories of Troy and the Greeks 1,000 years before that. So back into the 3rd millennium BCE, the time of the Egyptian pyramids and the Mesopotamian city-states. It was during that even earlier time that a migration of peoples across the plateau of the Asian steppes, a branch of which that migration will find its way into the area we now call Greece, that is, into the Eastern Mediterranean. There were several branches to this great human migration that we call the Indo-European migration, and it is defined now by a single identifiable feature, you might say, of the peoples migrating, and that is the languages which they spoke, that scholars call both Indo-European and, in their earlier form, Proto-Indo-European. That prefix proto means an early version of something. So an early version of Indo-European. Just to make it a little simpler, we'll call that early version of Proto-Indo-European, we'll call it Pi. Pi speakers now are part of this evolving, unfolding, unspooling of a thread of history in migration that will lead us to Homer's heroes. The ancestors of Homer's heroes, that is, of Achilles and Ajax and the great warriors of the Trojan War, who lived in Mycenae, that is, who came from the mainland side in the west of the Aegean, were probably themselves immigrants. So if we take another look here at the outline of what we now recognize as Greece, the familiar hand-shaped Peloponnese, and then the mainland, just thinly connected by an isthmus here. You see Athens on the mainland part of a larger sort of continental finger that sticks down into the Eastern Mediterranean. Taken all together here, this is what we regard today as the nation of Greece. But 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, it was not yet Greece. It was a place with newly arriving immigrants who did not call themselves Greeks. We don't know what they called themselves. They didn't tell us. But who over time, through the mythologizing of their exploits, will be claimed by a later generation who do call themselves Greeks. So many layers of history here that we're peeling back, and the clues, the artifacts, the physical evidence that ties it all together. From the distinctive pottery they created, what scholars call cord pottery, that has been found here in the northern regions of Macedonia, going back as far as 2500 BCE, suggesting a first arrival. You know, when we find the earliest artifacts in one location and then later newer artifacts in another, it gives us an idea of their migratory path. Might it also not be a clue as to what later Greeks considered the birthplace of the Greek identity and the home of the gods, nearby Mount Olympus, which geographically we would find then farther south in this region here of the Greek, what is now the Greek mainland, attributed in Homer's day as the birthplace of the Greek people and the home of the gods themselves, of Zeus and Athena and Apollo, upon Mount Olympus, one of the highest points, looking up into the clouds. Again, you can sort of understand why for the poets that would have been close enough to the gods themselves. We're the ancestors of Homer's heroes, those who come into the picture from the north as part of a migration down into the Greek mainland. Were these the ancestors of the heroes Homer mythologized in the work of the Iliad and its companion, the Odyssey? Was this part of a larger, actual ancient migration of people whose ancestral homeland was somewhere farther to the north and east in the region north of the Black Sea that we call the Asian steppes? Well, the reason we ask the question is because that's exactly the conclusion that has been drawn by historians and linguists who followed this migration in reverse. If we start in Greece and go back in a kind of reverse course, it'd be like starting in Sacramento and following, Anglo migration back, across the Mississippi to the Atlantic coast, and then we have to get in our ships and sail even further east to the Isles of England and the ancestral homeland of the English-speaking peoples. Yeah, that would be the manifest destiny migration in reverse, you might say. Well, this is the Greek version of the manifest destiny migration in reverse, and based on linguistic evidence, that is the languages that people spoke, because those too can be deconstructed. That is, you can follow the trail of language back into time to see how language itself evolves through the ages. So based on linguistic evidence, these early Greeks spoke a Proto-Indo-European or Pi language whose dialect shared linguistic traits with the languages of other peoples, stretching all the way from India to Ireland. And this is really the exciting part of all this linguistic evidence. If we take the modern languages spoken by people occupying modern India or even Iran or regions of the Mediterranean like Greece and Italy, and then farther north to Ireland, what linguistic scholars have been able to piece together is that all the languages spoken, from the Gaelic to the Latin to the Greek to the Aryan languages, Farsi in Iran, and the Sanskrit languages in India, of Hindi, that all of these languages have ancestral connections. That is, they are connected through time and culture to earlier speakers of these languages who themselves were tied together by culture and language in what we call the Proto-Indo-European migration. So here's a quick list from Celtic to German. And because of German, by the way, English as well. English is a Germanic language. Italic, Balto-Slavic, Balkan, Hellenic, that's Greek, Anatolian, Armenian, Indo-Aryan, that includes India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran, where Farsi, for example, is spoken today, and the Kurdish areas of Turkey and Iraq, even as far to the east as Western China, the Tocharian language groups of Western China, like the Uyghur people, for example, who are now the subjects of such great oppression by the Chinese state. So you can make a language map that, going back in time, connects all these people, and the elements, the trace elements, still today are discernible. Here's what it looks like on an actual map, what we call the Indo-European language migrations, thought to be centered here somewhere north of the Black Sea. The ancestral peoples over time spread in the compass directions east and south and west and north, splitting apart from one another, their languages evolving and changing, and over time even becoming more or less unintelligible to the various streams of migratory peoples. The red area corresponds on this map to the area which may have been settled by Indo-European speakers between 3500 and 2500 BCE, and the green area were those that came later, including here in the Eastern Mediterranean, here in Greece. So if we think of the migration of the heroes, the ancestors of the heroes of Homer, down from the steppes of Asia here in a kind of western and southern direction, finding ultimately a home, a new home, in what will come to be called the Greek mainland, just in time for the Bronze Age wars between the Trojans and the Greeks to take place, to inspire the later storytelling of Homer, and even the much later excavation efforts by Heinrich Schliemann. So many layers, many threads, many strands. You almost need a player program to keep it all straight. But the fascinating thing about it is that the very language I'm speaking to you now, English itself, part of the Germanic family of languages, relating to the original Proto-Indo-European family of languages, connects not only the the heroes of Homer rather, but our own English-speaking peoples today. So whether or not your ancestry is English, if you speak the language, you too are part of the web of history that we're discussing. And the pieces are there. The evidence is there. The language cognates, as we call them, the proto-cognate of Deus, which referred to the religious reverence paid to certain gods of the sky. In this case, Deus literally meant the sky father in the original Proto-Indo-European. Over time, those languages migrate with their various peoples. In Sanskrit, that is the language that takes root in modern northern India, the word becomes Deva from Deus. Deva from Deus, a Sanskrit word for God. In Latin, the word becomes Deus. If you ever heard the Latin Mass, you hear the priest intoning in Latin Deus, which is the Latin word for God that will take root in Italy. And among the Greeks, the cognate Zeus or Zeus, the Greek god of mythology. All three of these words, from Indian to Latin to Greek, from Deva to Deus to Zeus, are essentially offspring of the same Proto-Indo-European word of Deus. And so what that tells us again is these people migrated and separated from one another. Their languages evolved and refined, but some of those trace elements remained. In addition to language, certain cultural similarities appear among the Pi speakers of the Bronze Age. They tended to be people who worshipped a sky god, as the language suggested, and other gods who waged war from the skies, especially throwing down thunderbolts. If you know a little bit of Norse mythology, you know that characters like Odin and Thor are also great warrior images, great warrior symbols, who also likewise harness the thunder from the sky. They tended to recite heroic poetry by voice, by memory. It's thought that's how Homer's poems had their origin, through a period in which writing was forgotten, a so-called Greek Dark Ages, after the fall of the city-states of the Bronze Age, reinvented, reborn, reimagined in Homer's time centuries later as a oral storytelling poetry tradition, telling of great heroes and wars. They dug great graves for their leaders, their elites, their warrior heroes, where Schliemann found the gold-plated mask that he proclaimed to be that of the mythical Agamemnon. And those warrior graves, by the way, have yielded a great treasure trove for archaeologists ever since. They were equestrians, meaning they came on horseback. You'll recall in the first map we did this semester, the domestication of the horse in that northern steppe region above the Black Sea. They were riders of horses and used horses to not only transport them, but in war, the horse was the great battlefield tank of its day, you might say. Cavalry warriors on horseback proving almost always to be irresistible in battle to those who fought on foot. Wheeled chariots and carts. Yeah, when we read the piece by Homer where Zeus harnesses his bronze shod horses, they are winged horses. They fly him off in a great chariot in the sky. That's the mythic version, right? That's the heroic poetry version. But in fact, physical artifactual evidence suggests that the ancestors, the Proto-Indo-European speakers, that is, who came into these regions, often did so on horseback and in war chariots, two-wheeled chariots, now not to be confused with the ancient prototype from Mesopotamia, which was a four-wheeled cart, but a two-wheeled war chariot that again proved almost unbeatable in battle. And, they're domesticated horses. They were the breeders of horses. They raised horses. They raised them for war. They raised them for transport. They raised them for labor. And so they were very much part of the horse cultures that will spread across the Eurasian landmass into the various corners and regions from India to Iran to Greece to Italy, even as far north as Ireland. Stock breeding and animal husbandry. They brought their herds with them, whether they were cattle herds or sheep herds or goat herds. To this day, the Greeks love their goat cheese, and that is really a kind of historical legacy of these horsemen, these breeders of domesticated animals. And the broad spectrum diets, from the dairy and the cheeses to the meats and other things cultivated from their animals like hides and bone and you name it. They left nothing to waste, and over time developed great agricultural traditions, not to mention storytelling traditions. Traditions that would be remembered in monuments, in carvings, in statues, and great epic poetry. A warrior caste, yeah, that's what Homer describes, that conquers the native peoples of Greece and over time creates a cultural blend that will, through the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, come to be called Greek. It's basically the birth of what we call Greek culture and identity. At its height, the Mycenaean towns were fed by agriculture and grain storage. Their trade stretched across northern Europe and Scandinavia. Revenues were used to build the palace compounds and prepare for war. Here again is the great Lion's Gate. I want you to remember the iconography here of two lions. The lion symbol, of course, had been, familiar to great civilizations from the very beginning, in this region, Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent. The lion seemed to symbolize all that was powerful and all that was courageous and strong, in the natural world. And so, not surprisingly, those who wished to be seen similarly, the great rulers and elites and kings and conquerors, often identified with the lion's symbol. When you entered Mycenae under the Lion's Gate, you knew you were entering a place of power and wealth. Here's what the archaeologist's map looks like. You can see how spread across that Acropolis at the center, the high point, the kind of megaron or main palace itself, with the various subsidiary buildings and rooms and storehouses and apartments of those who lived and worked and served in Mycenae. As the ruins look today after excavation, what they look like in the artist's conception and all their finery, with their painted columns and their Greek or gold inlaid balconies, their marbled tile floors. Yeah, it must have been really something to behold. The status that came with wealth and power. The workshops of Pylos turned out manufactured items, including bronzeware and perfumed oils that the Greeks then exported from faraway places, or to faraway places, such as Egypt and Anatolia. That is, Greek ware has been found in the excavated sites dating back to that period in those places. So evidence of connection through commerce and trade. These were worldly civilizations. In addition to the Greeks, the other great pie-speaking people were the Hittites. The Hittites, we don't remember them as frequently now because they don't continue to exist as a living identity, but we can find them sure enough in history and certainly in the Bronze Age. They're even referenced in the Judaic biblical stories. The Hittites are. They're found in the Bible. Here we see a bronze bas relief carving showing two Hittite warriors in their two-wheeled chariot. One of them, a steersman, the other, the archer, literally running over their enemies, this unfortunate victim of Hittite conquest. All the basic elements are there, mounted on horse-drawn chariots to find the Hittite expansion and the familiar imagery by the time of Homer's Trojan War. The Hittites were not featured in the Iliad, but they might as well have been, since the civilizations they inspired included, for example, city-states like Troy on the Asian coastline. Here's a map to help us get our bearings again. The Hittites coming down from the Black Sea region into this region of modern-day Turkey or Anatolia. Here you see the boundary between modern Syria and Turkey, the location of the ancient Bronze Age Hittite kingdom that became a great rival, for example, of not only the Greeks but also the Egyptians, as we'll see. A warrior caste trading kingdom built on the rivers of Anatolia that would be one of the power players of its day. As early as 1900 BCE, the Hittites had subjugated the peoples of Anatolia and brought them into a system of alliance and governing. So the pattern is pretty clear here. Where these Proto-Indo-European speakers go, they tend to go on horseback with war chariots, with great material culture, including agriculture and the domestication of animal herds. They have powerful weapons, they're archers, they're spearmen, they're swordsmen, and they often form a kind of irresistible tide of conquest in the regions where they arrive. Like the older civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Hittites adopted agriculture, urban populations, and stratified social classes, as well as monarchy with state bureaucracies. Trade and warfare were principal influences on their foreign relations. So these are sophisticated states now that arrive from this blend of Proto-Indo-European, local, and even older civilizations like Mesopotamia. They were great assimilators of those civilizations. What they found of use, they would often then simply blend into their own states. The Hittite Empire integrated its subjects into a well-organized economic, political, and military system. And modern Turkey was once the capital of the Hittite Empire, situated in a broad and not especially fertile plateau in the central highlands of Anatolia. It grew into an imperial capital between 1800 and 1500 BCE. The state incorporated small farmers and recognized them, by the way, legally with property rights, who provided food and wool to the markets organized by the state. Hittites took advantage of centuries-old agricultural traditions in Anatolia, including orchards featuring apple and pomegranate trees. So think about that next time you go to the produce section of your market. Much of the fruit, particularly the citrus fruits and such that you find in your local Safeway or Bel Air, have their own ancestral origins in this great culture of Western Asia. The Hittite defeat of the powerful Babylonian Empire in 1595 BC. Babylonian Empire, which was the part of the Mesopotamian tradition between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the south. Well, the Hittites will descend and defeat the Babylonians in 1595 BCE, giving them military supremacy over Mesopotamia and Syria for the next 2 centuries. And guess what? In some of their principal towns, you entered through, can you tell what they are? A lion's gate. Almost a kind of copy, if you will, of the lion's gate we saw over on the Greek mainland in Mycenae. Is this a coincidence? No. Remember, the lion was a common motif in the civilizations of the Near East, and because they were both descended from Proto-Indo-European speakers, the Hittites and the Greeks carried many of the same cultural baggage and symbols and icons, including the fierce lion that came to adorn their city gates. So, not a coincidence, but additional evidence then of a once common cultural heritage that was spread by migration to distant lands and evolved into slightly different but still recognizable forms. Yeah, this was the Hittite city of Hattusha and its own Lion's Gate entrance, evoking that of the Mycenae Lion's Gate that Schliemann had found over on the Greek mainland. Even more than the Greeks, the Hittites bore the cultural influence of ancient Mesopotamia. And many of the Hittite symbols still resemble the earlier precursors among the great city-states of Sumer, such as Babylon and Ur and Uruk. The Hittite god figure here, although he is drawn from the sky god imagery of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, he's dressed up differently. He may be a sky god, but he wears Mesopotamian clothes and dress and facial beard. Historians call this syncretism, the blending of older traditions with new traditions, the recognizable and familiar with the new and the innovative. Even the Hittite written script is borrowed from Akkadian cuneiform to the left. It should look familiar from our discussion of Mesopotamian cuneiform, the oldest writing system in the world, now borrowed by these Proto-Indo-European Hittite people to express their own Proto-Indo-European Hittite spoken language. So borrowing written script from a different spoken language to create a written script for their language. Very ingenious. And it also then made the transition easier to governing over Mesopotamia because of the familiarity of things like a god's dress. This could have been, Gilgamesh for all the world knew, but it was a Hittite god dressed up like Gilgamesh. And then the writing, the written script also bearing the familiar imprint of the cuneiform. All right, so that'll finish up our bit on Indo-European. One final part to this lecture, the clash of empires in the late Bronze Age. We'll go ahead and put in part 3 of our lecture on the Indo-European migrations.